The shattered world. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the sky, spilling warmth into the small home where Leah Robinson lived with her parents. The house wasn't grand, but it was filled with love, each wall holding stories of laughter, lessons, and the quiet hum of dreams waiting to unfold. Leah, a bright-eyed 9-year-old, was the heart of her parents' world. She woke up that morning to the smell of cinnamon pancakes, her mother's specialty. Bounding down the hallway in her fuzzy socks, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in one hand and a history book in the other. "Good morning, Daddy," she chirped, climbing into his lap like she always did. "Good morning, my little warrior," he greeted, ruffling her thick curls. "Are you ready for today's adventure?" Leah nodded enthusiastically. Her mother, a nurse at the local hospital, smiled as she set a plate of pancakes in front of her. "We're going to the countryside today. Just the three of us. No school, no work, just us," she said, brushing a gentle kiss against Lee's forehead. Lee's heart soared. She lived for these days, the ones where the world felt big and full of possibility. Her father always told stories about history, about the people who fought for justice, who stood up when it was hard, who made the world a little better. Leah wanted to be one of them. She wanted to be strong, like her father, and kind, like her mother. The drive to the countryside was filled with laughter and music. Her mother hummed along to the radio while her father told her about Harriet Tubman and how she led people to freedom, about Martin Luther King Jr. and his dream of a better future. "But the world isn't always fair, sweetheart," her mother added gently. "Sometimes people will judge you before they know you. Sometimes they'll try to take things from you. But no one can take what's inside of you. Remember that." Leah held on to those words, not knowing how soon she would need them. The road that changed everything. The sun had begun to set as they made their way back home, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Leah sat in the back seat, watching the scenery blur past, her mind lost in the stories of the day. Then, everything changed. The road was slick from a light drizzle earlier in the evening. A pair of headlights appeared out of nowhere, bright, blinding, and fast. Her mother let out a sharp gasp. Her father yanked the wheel, but it was too late. Tires screeched. The world turned upside down. The car flipped. Glass shattered. Metal crunched against metal. And then, a scream. Her mother's voice. Then, silence. When Leah opened her eyes, everything was dark. She was upside down, still strapped in her seatbelt. A sharp pain throbbed in her arm, but she couldn't focus on that. She turned her head, her breath hitching in her throat. Her mother wasn't moving. "Mom?" Her voice was small, trembling. "Mommy?" No response. Her father groaned somewhere nearby, his voice weak. "Leah, don't move, help is coming." And then, flashing red and blue lights filled the broken pieces of their world. The arrest that stole her childhood. The sirens blared as paramedics pulled her out of the wreckage. Leah clung to the hope that her mother would wake up, that everything would be okay, but the hushed voices of the paramedics told her otherwise. She barely had time to process anything before she saw two police officers approaching her. "Are you Leah Robinson?" one of them asked, his tone void of warmth. She nodded, still in shock. The next moment, she felt something cold snap around her wrists. "Handcuffs. You're under arrest," the officer said. Her 9-year-old mind couldn't comprehend the words. What? But, why? "You're being charged with reckless endangerment, tampering with a vehicle, and manslaughter," the officer stated flatly. Manslaughter. She didn't even know what the word meant. Her father was too weak to stop them. The paramedics were too busy trying to keep him alive. So no one fought for her. She was shoved into the back of a police car, her tiny wrists bound in cold steel, her face streaked with tears. The last thing she saw before the car drove away was her mother's lifeless body being covered with a white sheet. Her entire world ended that night. And no one cared. A child behind bars. Leah Robinson sat in the back of the police car, her tiny hands bound by cold steel, her mind racing between disbelief and terror. The world outside moved in a blur, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off buildings, the distant wails of sirens, the muffled voices of officers speaking words she couldn't fully grasp. All she knew was that she was alone. The officer in the driver's seat didn't look at her. Neither did the one sitting next to her. To them, she wasn't a grieving daughter. She wasn't a scared little girl. She was a criminal. She shivered, not from the cold but from something deeper. A dread that curled around her small frame and squeezed like a snake. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "To the station," the officer beside her muttered, his tone void of sympathy. Leah swallowed hard. The station. That's where bad people went. But she wasn't bad. She hadn't done anything wrong. Had she? Her mind twisted in confusion. The accident had happened so fast. One moment, they were driving home, warm and safe, her father telling her stories. The next, her world was upside down, glass everywhere, her mother not moving, and suddenly, this. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to wake up from the nightmare. But when she opened them again, she was still here, trapped in the back seat of a moving cage. And then the realization hit her like a brick. No one was coming to save her. A criminal at 9 years old. When the car pulled into the station, Leah felt her stomach clench. The building loomed over her, its stone walls cold and unforgiving. The officers yanked open the door and pulled her out. The cuffs clanked as they guided her inside. Everything smelled strange, bleach, sweat, something metallic. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the grimy floors. Other officers barely glanced at her. One raised an eyebrow but said nothing. To them, maybe, she was just another case file. Just another number. They walked her down a long hallway, past desks stacked with paperwork and murmured conversations. Then, they stopped in front of a desk where a woman with tired eyes and a sharp gaze sat, tapping a pen against a keyboard. "Name?" the woman asked. "She's Leah Robinson," one of the officers replied. The woman frowned. Her eyes flicked to Leah, scanning her up and down. "She's a kid," she muttered under her breath. "She's being charged." The woman hesitated, but then her fingers started typing. Click. 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 Leah stood frozen, the world spinning around her. The woman handed the officer a form and nodded toward another door. Processing. Processing. The word sent a shiver through Lee's spine. Stripped of childhood. They took her fingerprints first. Her small fingers were pressed against an ink pad, then onto paper. The officer guiding her barely spoke, treating her as if she were an object, not a person. Next came the photo. They had her stand against a gray wall, holding a number plate. "Look straight ahead," a voice instructed. The flash burned into her eyes. Leah felt like she wasn't even real anymore. Like she was fading, becoming something else. Then, they took away her clothes. Her pink sweater, the one her mother had bought for her last Christmas, was peeled off her body. Her jeans, too. They gave her something scratchy, something that smelled of stale air and old sweat. She hugged herself, shivering. No one told her what was happening. No one explained why she was here, what she had done. A guard led her down another hallway, past doors with thick iron bars. The air was different here. Heavy. Suffocating. They stopped at a door. With a loud clang, it swung open. The guard gestured inside. In. Leah hesitated. Move, the guard snapped. She stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her. The first night in hell. The room was small, cold, and empty except for a metal bunk and a toilet in the corner. The walls were a dull, lifeless gray. No windows. No warmth. Leah turned in slow circles, her breathing shaky. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. But when she pressed her hands against the cold walls, they didn't dissolve. They didn't break apart and let her wake up in her bed, where her mother would be making breakfast, where her father would be reading his books. She was trapped. Her tiny legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the metal cot. She curled into herself, squeezing her eyes shut. "Mommy," she whispered. "Daddy?" Silence. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She was alone. She was alone. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. She wasn't sure. The heavy door stayed closed, and no one came. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every sound, the distant clatter of metal, the heavy footsteps outside, made her jolt, her breath catching in her throat. And then, just as her eyes started to droop from exhaustion, the door opened. A figure stepped inside. Leah sat up, blinking in the dim light. It wasn't a guard. It was another girl. A little older, maybe 13 or 14. Her hair was tied back in messy braids, her clothes the same dull, scratchy fabric as Lee's. But her eyes were sharp. The girl crossed her arms, sizing Leah up. "You're the new one?" she asked. Leah nodded, too scared to speak. The girl sighed. "Great. Another kid." She flopped onto the top bunk, leaning against the wall. Leah swallowed. Where am I?" she finally managed to whisper. The girl looked down at her. "Prison," she said flatly. "Welcome to your new home." Lee's stomach twisted. No. No, this wasn't her home. She wanted to go home. She wanted her mother. Her father. She wanted to wake up. But as the door clanged shut again, locking her inside, reality settled like a weight on her chest. She wasn't going home. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. A child in a cage. Leah sat frozen on the cold, metal bunk, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her cellmate, the older girl with sharp eyes and braided hair, had already turned her back to her, uninterested. The silence in the cell felt heavier than anything Leah had ever experienced. It wasn't like the silence in her bedroom at night, where the hum of the heater and the distant voices of her parents made her feel safe. This silence was thick, unnatural. It was the silence of concrete and steel, of lost hope and forgotten names. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her knees. This couldn't be happening. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her parents would come for her. Wouldn't they? But deep down, she already knew the truth. Her parents weren't coming. They couldn't. She was alone. And the world had thrown her away like she was nothing. The prison morning. A loud, jarring buzz shook Leah from a restless sleep. She hadn't even realized she had dozed off, but her body ached from the way she had curled up on the thin mattress. "Get up, newbie," her cellmate muttered from the top bunk. Leah rubbed her eyes. What's happening?" "Roll call." Leah blinked. Her head felt heavy, her body sluggish. She had barely slept, barely eaten. Everything felt like a blur. The door clanged open, and the harsh light from the hallway flooded the cell. A guard's voice barked from outside. "Out. Line up." The older girl jumped down first, giving Leah a quick glance before walking out. Leah hesitated. Would they hurt her if she didn't move fast enough? Her heart pounded as she forced herself off the bunk. Her bare feet hit the cold concrete floor, sending a shiver up her spine. She shuffled toward the door, stepping out into the hallway. It was worse than she imagined. The hallway was lined with other girls, all dressed in the same dull, scratchy uniform. Some looked just as scared as she felt, their eyes darting around anxiously. Others looked different. Like they had been here too long. Like they didn't care anymore. A guard walked down the line, eyes scanning each girl with an unreadable expression. "Move," he said, and the group began shuffling forward. Leah tried to keep up, but her legs were still wobbly. She nearly tripped, catching herself just in time. They were led into a cafeteria, and the sight made her stomach twist. Long, metal tables. Scratched, dented trays. A smell that wasn't quite food but something else, something she didn't recognize. The other girls moved quickly, grabbing trays and getting in line. Leah hesitated, unsure of what to do. Her cellmate, who hadn't spoken much since last night, sighed and yanked her forward. "Just follow me, newbie," she muttered. Leah nodded silently, sticking close to her. When she reached the counter, a grumpy-looking worker slopped something onto her tray. Leah stared at it. It was a pile of gray mush with a side of stale bread. Her stomach turned. She wasn't sure if she could eat this. But the hunger clawing at her insides told her she didn't have a choice. She followed her cellmate to a table in the corner, where a few other girls sat, their heads down, shoveling food into their mouths without speaking. The older girl plopped down, setting her tray in front of her. Leah hesitated before sitting too. She picked up a spoon, dipping it into the mush hesitantly. It smelled terrible. But when she took a small bite, it tasted even worse. Her face scrunched up, but she forced herself to swallow. "Better get used to it," her cellmate muttered, barely looking at her. "It's this or starve." Leah nodded weakly. Her cellmate finally sighed. "What's your name, newbie?" Leah looked up. "Leah." The older girl raised an eyebrow. "Leah, huh?" She took another bite of her food before nodding. "I'm Tasha." Tasha. It was the first somewhat normal thing Leah had encountered since being here. She swallowed another spoonful of the horrible food and tried not to cry. The monster with the badge. After breakfast, they were taken back into the hallways. But instead of returning to their cells, the guards led them into another room, a large, empty space with a few chairs and a desk at the front. Leah stood nervously, watching as a tall man in a stiff uniform walked in. His face was hard, unreadable, his hands folded behind his back. "Listen up," he barked, and the room fell silent. "My name is Officer Grant. I don't care who you were before you got here. I don't care what you think is fair or unfair. You're here now. That means you follow our rules." His eyes swept across the room, cold and sharp. No talking back. No questioning authority. No stepping out of line. You do what you're told, when you're told. Otherwise. He paused, letting the silence drag. Otherwise, you'll regret it. A chill ran down Lee's spine. This wasn't just prison. This was a place where people like her disappeared. Tasha stood stiffly beside her, eyes locked forward. Leah swallowed, mimicking her stance, not wanting to draw attention. Officer Grant continued. "New arrivals will be placed in work assignments. You'll be told where to go and what to do. If I hear any complaints, any disobedience," his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You won't like what happens." Leah felt a tight knot in her chest. Then, his eyes landed on her. He tilted his head slightly. "You." Lee's blood ran cold. She was barely breathing when he took a step toward her, looking her up and down. "You're the little murderer, aren't you?" A few girls snickered from the back. Lee's stomach twisted. Officer Grant crouched slightly, so his face was level with hers. "You don't belong here, do you?" he asked in a mockingly soft voice. Lee's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Too bad," he whispered. "Because no one's coming for you." Lee's hands trembled at her sides. Tasha nudged her arm slightly, a silent warning, "Don't react." So she didn't. She kept her eyes down, her lips pressed together, her body frozen. After a long, tense moment, Officer Grant straightened. "Dismissed," he snapped. The girls shuffled away quickly, some whispering under their breath. Lee's legs felt weak as she followed Tasha out. Her heart was pounding. Tasha walked beside her, her expression unreadable. "That guy?" she muttered under her breath. "Stay out of his way." Leah nodded, still shaking. Because something told her that Officer Grant wasn't just a guard. He was something worse. And if she wasn't careful, he would destroy her. Surviving the cage. Leah sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers curled into the thin, scratchy blanket as the harsh fluorescent light flickered above her. Sleep had become a distant memory, something she barely grasped in fleeting moments before the constant fear jolted her awake. She wasn't safe here. She wasn't safe anywhere. Her cellmate, Tasha, had made that much clear on their second night together. "This ain't a place for weak little girls," she had muttered, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. "You either toughen up, or you get eaten alive." Leah swallowed hard, her throat dry. Toughen up. How was she supposed to toughen up when she was only 13? How was she supposed to survive a place like this? The unwritten rules. By the end of the first week, Leah had learned that prison had its own laws, rules no guard would ever explain but every inmate knew by heart. Don't look weak. The moment they smelled fear, they'd come for you. Don't ask for help. Help didn't exist here. Don't ever, ever trust the guards. Leah learned the third rule the hard way. She had been sitting in the yard, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to stay invisible, when a guard walked up behind her. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "First week's tough, huh?" Leah turned her head slowly, glancing up at him. He wasn't like Officer Grant. He had kind eyes, a slight smile, and something in his tone that felt almost human. "You doing okay?" Leah hesitated. Was she? No. Not even close. Her lip trembled. She hadn't spoken much to anyone since arriving, but something about the way he asked made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to say she didn't belong here, that they had made a mistake, that she wanted to go home. But before she could open her mouth, a sharp whisper cut through the air. "Don't. Tasha." She was leaning against the fence, watching them with cold, knowing eyes. The guard sighed and straightened. "All right. Just hang in there, okay?" Then he walked away. Leah turned to Tasha, confused. "Why?" Tasha didn't let her finish. "Don't ever talk to them," she hissed. "But don't." Leah clamped her mouth shut. Tasha exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face like she was trying to decide whether or not to say something. Then she crouched down in front of her, eyes hard. "Listen to me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You think he's nice? You think he's different?" Leah bit her lip but didn't answer. Tasha scoffed. "That's how they get you." Lee's brows furrowed. "They pretend to care. Make you feel safe. And when you finally let your guard down," she leaned in closer, "they show you what they really are." A shiver ran down Lee's spine. "They don't care about us," Tasha continued. "None of them do. And if you let them think you need help, they'll use it against you. Leah swallowed hard. Tasha stood up. You wanna survive? Leah hesitated, then nodded. Tasha's jaw tightened. Then act like you don't need saving. Leah looked down at her hands. They were trembling. But when she clenched them into fists, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't cry anymore. She wouldn't let them see her break. She wouldn't let them win. The silent threat. Days blurred together. Leah kept her head down, spoke only when necessary, and avoided eye contact with anyone who looked like trouble. But trouble had a way of finding her anyway. It happened in the laundry room. She was folding a stack of uniforms when she felt it, a presence behind her. Slow. Heavy. Dangerous. She didn't turn around. Not at first. But then. A low voice. Heard you're the little murderer. Lee's blood went cold. She turned, her hands clenched tightly around the fabric. A girl stood there, tall and wiry, her face scarred from old fights. A few others flanked her, standing just close enough to block Leah in. Leah swallowed hard. She had seen this girl before. Chandra. One of the ones who had been here the longest. One of the ones who owned this place in ways even the guards couldn't. Chandra smirked, taking a slow step forward. You kill somebody, huh? Lee's throat tightened. No, she whispered. Chandra tilted her head. No? Leah shook her head quickly. I didn't do anything. Chandra chuckled. That so? She took another step. Leah instinctively backed away, mistake. Chandra's smirk widened. Scared? Leah tried to shake her head again, but her body betrayed her. She was scared. And Chandra could see it. The older girl clicked her tongue. See, that's the thing about this place, she mused. Nobody cares what's true. They only care about what they can use. She leaned in close, her breath hot against Lee's ear. And right now, she whispered. They think you're a killer. Leah barely had time to react before Chandra shoved her, hard. She stumbled back, hitting the table. The other girls laughed. Lee's chest heaved. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she did neither. She just stood there, frozen, as Chandra tilted her head, watching her like a cat watching a mouse. Then, just as suddenly as she started, she pulled back. Relax, little murderer, she said, her voice almost playful. I'm just getting to know you. She winked before sauntering off, her lackeys following behind her. Leah barely breathed until they were gone. Then, finally, she exhaled. Her hands were shaking. Her stomach churned. She turned, gripping the laundry table for support, sucking in sharp, shaky breaths. She had barely survived her first encounter. But deep down, she knew. It wouldn't be the last, beneath the surface. Leah sat on the edge of her cot, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the cold concrete wall. The laughter of the other inmates still echoed in her ears, the taunting words Chandra had left behind wrapping around her like a noose. They think you're a killer. She clenched her fists. She wasn't. She wasn't. But in this place, the truth didn't matter. Perception was everything. And right now, she was prey. The price of survival. Tasha sat across from her on the opposite bunk, arms folded. She had been watching Leah since the encounter in the laundry room, and finally, she spoke. You need to do something, she said. Leah blinked. What do you mean? Tasha sighed, shaking her head. Chandra's testing you. If you don't push back, she's gonna own you. And once she does, everyone else will, too. Lee's stomach churned. She barely survived that last run-in, how was she supposed to fight back? I don't want to fight. Tasha rolled her eyes. Then you're already dead. Lee's breath hitched. Tasha leaned forward, voice low. Look, I get it. You're scared. But out there? She nodded toward the cell bars. Nobody cares. You either make them fear you, or you spend every single day afraid. Leah swallowed hard. She didn't want to live like this. She didn't want to be afraid. But how could she stop it? She was 13. She had never thrown a punch in her life. She wasn't strong. She wasn't tough. She wasn't. Hey. Leah looked up. Tasha's gaze softened. You don't have to be the strongest. You just have to be strong enough. Leah exhaled shakily. Could she be? The first step. The next morning, Leah kept her head up when she walked into the cafeteria. It wasn't much, just a shift in posture, a set to her jaw, but it was enough. Enough to make them notice. Chandra's group was already seated when Leah passed. She felt their eyes on her, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't. For the first time since arriving, she didn't look like prey. She wasn't sure how long she could keep it up, but for now, it was enough to make Chandra smirk in amusement rather than hunger. For now, it bought her time. The nightmares that never left. That night, Leah dreamed of the accident. The courtroom. The faces of the people who had judged her. The sound of the gavel slamming down. We find the defendant guilty. Leah gasped awake, heart pounding. She wasn't in the courtroom. She was in a cell. And this wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands to her face. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. But the world didn't care about fair. She had to survive it anyway. A dangerous proposition. A week later, Leah was in the yard when she felt someone approach. She turned, Tasha. But she wasn't alone. A girl stood beside her, taller, older, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Leah, Tasha said. This is Reena. Leah frowned. She had seen Reena before, everyone had. She was one of the oldest inmates, and unlike Chandra, she didn't need to prove her strength. Everyone already knew it. Reena studied Leah for a moment, then spoke. I heard you need protection. Leah stiffened. Stop, Reena cut her off. You're alone. Chandra wants you broken. If you don't have backup, you won't last another month. Leah hesitated. Why are you helping me? Reena smirked. I'm not. Protection isn't free. Lee's hands clenched. Then what do you want? Reena tilted her head. Information. Leah frowned. About what? Reena's smile didn't reach her eyes. About why the guards are so interested in you. Leah froze. Her mind raced back to the guard who had spoken to her. The one Tasha had warned her about. The way he had looked at her, not like a threat, not like a criminal, but like a puzzle he was trying to solve. Had she imagined it? Or was there something more? You don't know, do you? Reena said, watching her closely. Leah swallowed. Know what? Reena exhaled, shaking her head. Then we have a bigger problem than I thought. Lee's pulse quickened. What problem? Reena's gaze darkened. You're not supposed to be here. The words hit Leah like a punch to the gut. She knew it. She had always known it. But hearing someone else say it, hearing it confirmed. She swallowed hard. What do you mean? Reena crossed her arms. The guards? They're watching you. More than usual. And I don't think it's because they think you're dangerous. Lee's mind spun. Then why? What did they know that she didn't? Reena sighed. Look, I don't have all the answers. But if you help me figure it out, I'll make sure you don't get eaten alive in the process. Leah hesitated. Could she trust her? Could she trust anyone? But then she thought of Chandra. She thought of the guards. She thought of the trial. And she knew. She couldn't survive this place alone. She nodded. Reena smirked. Good choice, kid. The truth is coming. That night, as Leah lay awake in her cot, a thought kept circling in her head. She wasn't supposed to be here. But why? And more importantly, who wanted her here badly enough to make sure she stayed? The answer was coming. She just had to survive long enough to find it. The secrets that could kill. Leah couldn't sleep. Reena's words echoed in her head. You're not supposed to be here. She turned over in her cot, staring at the ceiling. What did that mean? Why were the guards watching her? Why had she, a 13-year-old girl, been thrown into a prison meant for hardened criminals? It didn't make sense. Unless it wasn't about what she had done. It was about what someone wanted to hide. The weight of a name. The next morning, Reena met her in the yard, slipping a folded piece of paper into Lee's hand. Read it when you're alone, she muttered before walking away. Lee's heart pounded as she shoved the paper into her waistband. She waited until later that night, when the lights went out and the cells fell into silence. With shaky hands, she unfolded the note. It was a single sentence, scribbled in rushed handwriting. Who was your father? Lee's breath caught. She hadn't thought about her father in years. Because he was dead. Because he had left them before she was even born. Because, as far as she knew, he had never wanted her. She clenched the paper, her mind racing. Why would Reena ask this? What did her father have to do with anything? Unless she had never asked about him. Never searched for his name. Never questioned why her mother refused to speak of him. And maybe that had been a mistake. Because if Reena was right, her father might be the reason she was here. A visit from the warden. The next day, something even stranger happened. Leah was pulled from her cell. 2 guards escorted her down the dimly lit corridors. But not to the cafeteria. Not to the yard. Not to the wretched solitary confinement rooms where girls went and sometimes never came back. No. They took her to the warden's office. Lee's pulse pounded as she was shoved into a chair. The office was cold, almost clinical. The warden, a tall man with graying hair and sharp, scrutinizing eyes, folded his hands on his desk. Leah Winters, he said slowly, as if tasting her name. She swallowed but said nothing. He leaned forward. Tell me, child. How are you, adjusting? She stared at him. What kind of question was that? Was he mocking her? She clenched her fists under the table. I don't belong here. The warden's lips twitched. That's a matter of perspective, isn't it? Leah felt anger rise in her throat. You know I don't, she said. For a long moment, the warden simply watched her. Then he leaned back, exhaling. I imagine you're starting to have questions. Lee's heart pounded. So he knew. He knew there was something wrong. He knew she wasn't supposed to be here. She forced herself to remain still. Who was my father? Something flickered in the warden's eyes. Something that almost looked like regret. He sighed, rubbing his temple. I can't tell you that. Leah gritted her teeth. Why? He hesitated. Because if you knew. He stopped himself. Lee's blood ran cold. Because if I knew, what? Before she could press him, the warden straightened, his expression hardening. This conversation never happened. Then he nodded to the guards. Take her back. Leah wanted to fight. wanted to scream, wanted to demand the truth. But all she could do was let the guards drag her back to her cell. The silent message. That night, she found another note under her pillow. The truth is buried in Block D. Lee's heart stuttered. Block D. The restricted section of the prison. No one was allowed there except the worst of the worst. The ones who weren't meant to see daylight again. The ones who had secrets that couldn't risk escaping. Lee's fingers tightened around the note. If the truth was there, then she would find it. No matter what it took. Because the more she uncovered, the more she realized. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about uncovering the lie that had stolen her life.